Good morning, everybody. For the Methods for Scientific Inquiry project, myself, Sarah Buckley, and Erica MacMillan were Group 2, and we were assigned experimental research. Experimental research can be defined as an objective, systematic investigation that examines causality and is characterized by the following: a researcher-controlled manipulation of the independent variable, the presence of a distinct control group, and the random assignment of subjects to either the experimental or control condition. In order to be considered experimental research, it must have all three of these variables. The purpose of experimental research is to test the null hypothesis by means of applying an intervention to experimental subjects but not to the control subjects, and then measuring the effect on that dependent variable. An example of a type of experimental research is a randomized control trial, so an RCT, which is a trial of an intervention using the pre-test, post-test control group design or another experimental design closely related to it in order to produce a definitive evidence for an intervention. So when determining whether or not experimental research is quantitative or qualitative, we looked at both of the definitions of each of those terms. So quantitative research is a formal, objective, systematic study process that counts or measures in order to answer a research question. Its data is analyzed numerically. So because experimental research is also defined as being objective, it was obvious that experimental research is quantitative. Experimental research is directly measuring the cause and effect of controlling different variables, and the data that's collected will be numerical data that will either show positive or negative correlations in relation to the variables you are testing. So the experimental process consists of a couple of steps. First, you must identify and define the problem and your topic of research. Next, you're going to formulate hypotheses, and then you'll move on to constructing an experimental design that will represent all the elements, conditions, and relations of the consequences. So that includes selecting a sample of subjects. Then with those subjects, you're going to either group or pair them. After that, you'll determine which will be the control group and which will be the experimental group. You'll identify and control non-experimental factors. Select any instruments that you will use to measure outcomes. Then conduct a pilot study and determine the place, time, and duration of your actual experiment. After that, the experiment will take place. You will compile data and reduce to usable form, and then apply an appropriate test for significance. And then after that, you'll draw conclusions, present your results and findings. So experimental design can be broken down into different types. So we won't go in depth with each one of them, but you should just be aware that there are different designs for each type of experimental research. So there's the pre-test, post-test control group design, which is considered the true experimental design, which can further be broken down into randomized block design and nested design. There's also post-test only control group design, the Solomon 4 group design, factorial or the Fisher factorial design, and the crossover design or counterbalanced design. Here's an example of experimental research. A group of researchers were set out to determine to see if treatment for alcohol dependence in a primary care setting would be as effective as an outpatient specialist setting. So 288 adults fulfilling the ICD-10 criteria for alcohol dependence were randomly put into either primary care or outpatient care. So you can see the 288 adults were evenly divided into each group. So the primary outcome measured was a change in weekly alcohol consumption at a 6-month follow-up as compared to baseline. So why is this experimental research? As we had said earlier in the presentation, experimental research has those 3 characteristics. So they need to have researcher-controlled manipulation of the independent variables, a presence of a distinct control group, and they need to be randomly assigned subjects. So this is considered experimental research because the researcher controlled the manipulation of said variables and creating the control group, which was the outpatient specialists, and the experimental group, which was the primary care. Those participants were randomly assigned to each of those groups, and this study is considered an example of the pre-test, post-test nested design. To elaborate a little more, the pre-test, post-test nested design is one of the pre-test, post-test control group design subtypes. So it's a classic experimental design in which random assignment is made by assigning groups of subjects instead of single subjects. So some of the challenges and limitations of experimental research include human error. We all make mistakes. Personal bias of researchers. Your sample size might not represent the population being studied. Artificial results can be produced, and parts of the study or the entire study may be difficult to replicate. It's difficult to measure the human response in experimental research, and experimental studies often require a lot of funding. Here are our references. We appreciate any feedback, questions, and comments from our fellow classmates and instructor. Thank you.